October had turned the mud to iron. I stood on my own porch, watching Harrison Croft climb down from his lacquered buggy like a man who had never once worried about the ground beneath his boots. Two hired men followed, then three more from the sheriff's office, and behind them, a scatter of townfolk who had come to watch the way people come to watch a hanging. Croft was already smiling. He had a way of smiling that never reached his eyes, just pulled the meat of his cheeks up toward his temples and showed his back teeth. He set one polished boot on my bottom step like he owned it, which I suppose he believed he did. Silas. He said my name the way a man names a stray dog. Familiar, dismissive. I said nothing. My coffee had gone cold in my hand. My thumb was working a small chip on the rim of the cup, round and round, smooth against the callus. That's when I heard the creak of the gate. I didn't turn. Half the crowd did, and I watched their faces, so I didn't have to watch. Him watched the amusement flicker first, then the contempt settle in like weather finding a valley. Vance Callister came up the path with his hat already in his hands. His coat was elk hide, worn thin at the elbows. A scar ran from his left cheekbone down past his jaw, silver white, old enough to have its own history. His boots were mud to the ankle, and his knuckles were the color of saddle leather, cracked at two of the joints. He stopped at the base of my steps. He did not look at Croft. He did not look at the men behind Croft or the people at the fence. He looked at me, steady and unblinking, and he held his hat against his chest with both hands. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "I'd like to ask for your daughter's hand." The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then Croft laughed. Not a chuckle, a full-bellied, head-back roar that brought his hired men up with it. Then a ripple through the fence crowd. Then one of the women in good wool pressing a gloved hand to her mouth, but not stopping the sound from coming through. Croft wiped his eye, stepped down off my stairs and circled Callister the way a man circles something dead in the road to see what got it. Lord Almighty! He bent forward and spat in the mud 6 inches from Callister's boot. Man can't keep his own coat from falling off his back, and he wants to put a ring on a Thorne girl. Animals don't belong on a man's porch, son. They sure as hell don't get to touch a decent woman. Callister did not move. His jaw did not tighten. His eyes did not drop. His hands held his hat, and his hat held still. That was the thing I kept coming back to later. The stillness. Not the stillness of a man holding himself back. The stillness of a man who has stood in worse wind than this, and knows the storm does not require his fear to do its damage. I looked at his hands. I had shaken a lot of hands in 61 years. Merchants' hands, lawyers' hands, the soft grip of men who made their living with their mouths. Callister's hands were something else entirely, 2 instruments that had been used hard and put away wet and come back the next morning anyway. The crowd was still laughing. Croft turned to me with his arms spread wide, performing for the fence. "Well," he said, "tell the mongrel to get off your property, Silas, unless you've forgotten what your family name is worth." I looked at Vance Callister. He was still looking at me, waiting. The cold off the mountains had started coming down into the valley, and the sky to the north was the color of a bruise. I set my cold coffee on the rail. 3 weeks before Croft climbed out of his buggy, I didn't know Vance Callister's name. I knew his tracks. Elk hunter working alone, moving north into the high country before first light. I'd seen the sign twice near my fence line. Careful, wide-spaced steps, a man who knew how to carry his weight on frozen ground without announcing himself. I hadn't thought much of it. Then the night of the 14th came. I woke to the sound I'd been dreading since September, not a crash, but an absence. The particular quiet that follows something giving way. I pulled on my boots and took the lantern out back, and found what Croft's men had left 30 feet of fence line knocked flat, every post pulled, and the wire rolled up and taken, and my daughter standing at the edge of the damage with a lantern of her own. Maeve didn't say anything when she saw me. She held her light out over the gap, and her jaw was set the way her mother's used to get. Not fury, something colder and more permanent than fury. The cattle were already drifting through. We had maybe 2 hours before they scattered too far to gather in the dark. The temperature was dropping, and the sky had that flat, pressed-down look that comes before heavy snow. I started toward the barn for wire, and Maeve was already ahead of me. That's when the stranger stepped out of the dark, past the tree line. He stopped when he saw us. We stopped when we saw him. He had a rifle across his back and a dead coyote over one shoulder, and he looked at the flattened fence, then at Maeve, then at the pliers in her hand. He set the coyote down in the snow. He unslung his rifle and leaned it against the nearest standing post. He looked at me. "Got a spare hammer," he said. That was all he said. I studied him for a moment, the scar, the coat, the way he stood without shifting his weight like a man comfortable in the cold. Then I went to the barn and came back with 2 hammers and a box of staples, and we went to work. No introductions, no questions about who had done it or why. Maeve pulled wire and Callister drove posts, and I followed behind, setting staples, and the snow came down around us in big, wet flakes that soaked through wool in under an hour. I watched him work. He did not work like a man doing a favor. He worked like a man doing his own fence. Efficient, no wasted motion driving posts straight the first time without checking them twice. When a post cracked at the base, he tossed it aside without a word and pulled a replacement from the pile like he'd known the pile was there. Around the second hour, Maeve's hands gave out. Not all at once. I saw her switch the pliers to her left hand, then back. Then she gripped the wire between her palms instead of her fingers. Her hands in the lantern light were the color of raw meat, and when she pulled the wire, it left a thin red line across her palm that the cold filled in slowly. Callister saw it too. He didn't say anything. He moved to her side and took the wire from her. Not gentle, not rough. The way you take a tool from someone who needs a rest without making a performance of it, and he kept going. She watched him for a moment. Then she picked up the staple box and held it at his level so he didn't have to reach down. They did not speak. They did not look at each other more than the work required. But something happened in that silence that I have seen very few times in 61 years. 2 people finding the same rhythm without negotiating it the way water finds the same level on both sides of a wall. By the time the last post was in the snow was past our ankles. Callister picked up his rifle and his coyote and walked back into the dark without asking for a name or leaving one. Maeve stood at the finished fence with her bleeding hands at her sides and watched the tree line long after he was gone. I didn't ask her what she was thinking. Some things a father knows better than to interrupt. But I remembered that look standing on my porch 3 weeks later when a man with a scar and a cracked brim hat asked me for her hand. I had already seen what he was made of. The question was, whether I had the spine to say so out loud. I let the laughter run its course. Croft had a crowd, and he knew how to use one. He turned to the fence folk and spread his hands like a preacher, confirming what everyone already believed. And the people who owed him money laughed the loudest, because that is the tax you pay when you owe a man like Croft. Callister still had not moved. I picked up my cold coffee from the rail. I drank what was left of it. I set the cup back down and looked out past the fence at the road, then north at the sky, which had come down another 10 feet since morning and turned the color of an old bruise. "You want to marry my daughter," I said. Callister looked at me. "Yes, sir." "You got a house?" "Not yet." "Land?" "No." Croft cut in. "He's got lice and a skinning knife, Silas. That's the full inventory." Another laugh from the fence. I didn't look at Croft. I kept my eyes on Callister's hands, those cracked iron-colored hands still holding his hat against his chest. "I know sorrow's crest," I said. The laughing stopped faster than I expected. Even Croft went quiet. Every man in Oakhaven knew the name. The high ridge north of the valley above the timberline where the wind came off the peaks without anything to slow it. 3 ranchers had tried to winter cattle up there in the last 20 years. None of the cattle had come down in spring. "Maeve's got 50 head that can't survive the valley winter," I said. "Her pasture's gone, and her feed is near out. Croft's men saw to that." I let that sit 1 second. I want those 50 head taken up to Sorrow's Crest and kept alive through winter. Every one of them. Come spring thaw, they walk down on their own 4 legs. I'll pay off whatever note Croft holds on this property, and I'll give you my blessing besides. The silence had a different quality now. Croft recovered first. He stepped forward, and for a moment something moved behind his eyes that wasn't amusement. "You're sending this animal up to die on a frozen rock," he said, quieter now, talking to me directly. "You know that." "I'm setting terms," I said. He looked at me a long moment, then the smile came back wide and certain. He turned to the man on his left and held out his hand, and the man put a drawstring pouch in it, fat and heavy. Croft bounced it once in his palm. "10 gold eagles says your trapper freezes solid before February's out." He dropped the pouch back in his man's hand. "I'll hold that bet with the sheriff as witness." The sheriff, to his credit, looked at his boots. I said nothing. I looked at Callister. Callister had been watching me the whole time. Not Croft, not the crowd, not the pouch of coin. Me. His hat was still in his hands. His face had the same quality as the fence line that morning 3 weeks ago, functional, prepared, waiting for the work to start. "Terms are fair," he said. He put his hat on. One motion, no adjustment, settled exactly where it belonged. He turned toward his horse at the gate, a gray animal, short and heavy through the chest, mountain bred, and he stepped up into the saddle. He did not look back at the porch. He did not look at Croft. He pointed that gray horse north up the road and touched his heels to its flanks and rode at an easy walk toward the dark front of the coming storm. I watched him until the road curved and the willows took him. Behind me, Croft was already talking something about arrangements, about the deed, about how this would all be settled by February, and wasn't that a relief for everyone? His voice had gone back to its social register, warm and carrying, performing for the fence again. I did not turn around. 50 head of cattle. Sorrow's Crest. The worst winter in a decade, building itself up behind those clouds like a wall. And my daughter was not in the house. I had checked before I came outside. The kitchen was cold. The back door was unlatched. I gripped the porch rail and said nothing and let Croft talk. February came like a debt collector, not gradual, not polite. It came overnight, and it came with everything it had, whined off the northern peaks that drove snow horizontal, that packed itself into the gaps between logs, that buried the tree line up to the first branches and kept going. The valley folk latched their shutters and fed their fires double and waited. Up on Sorrow's Crest, there was no waiting. Vance had built the shelter in November, before the first hard freeze. 3 walls of stacked pine, a sloped roof lashed with rope and weighted with rocks, low enough to hold heat, wide enough for the cattle to press together through the worst nights. He had learned in his first week that the ridge split the wind at a particular angle, sent the worst of it sliding east past a granite outcrop, and he had built inside that angle with the precision of a man who understood that one wrong foot of placement meant death. He had run out of feeling in his left hand sometime around the 3rd week of January. Not numbness. He knew numbness. This was something past it, a heavy absence, like the hand had decided to stop participating. He kept it moving anyway. Kept splitting wood with it, kept running rope with it, kept checking the cattle with it in the dark hours before dawn, when the temperature dropped its lowest and the animals pressed together and breathed fog into the black air. The rope was what saved them that first month. He had strung lines between the shelter posts and the water trough and the woodpile so he could move in the dark and in the whiteout without losing direction. He had learned that from a trapper who had lost 3 fingers to disorientation in a blizzard. Not cold, not frostbite, just walking the wrong direction for 20 minutes. Then the February storm hit, and none of it was enough. The roof held for 2 days. On the 3rd night, the weight built past what the lashings could carry, and one of the main beams cracked, not broke, cracked, which was worse because it held just long enough for him to get under it. The left beam came down across his shoulder, and he went to one knee in the snow, and the cattle moved against him from 3 sides, and he stayed there a moment with the weight across him and his cheek against the nearest animal's flank, breathing. He got up. He found the rope line with his right hand. He got to the woodpile and got the spare timber and got back. What he could not fix was the main tie rope on the windward wall. It had been cut, not frayed, not worn, cut clean, at a point where the knot met the top post, a place a man would have to climb to reach. The wall was shifting. Another hour of wind and the whole north face would go, and the cattle would scatter into a storm they would not survive. He had the end of the rope in his hands and nothing to anchor it to, and his left arm had stopped lifting above his shoulder, and the wind was a sound, past, hearing something felt in the back teeth. He did not close his eyes, but his hands dropped. Then the wall exploded inward, not from wind, from a person, a shape driving through the snow with a shoulder down, staggering forward, catching the post with both arms before the wall could fall further. A rope uncoiling from one arm, a canvas pack dropping into the snow. Maeve did not say his name. She found the free end of the broken line, looped it twice around the post, with hands that moved like she had practiced it, and held it out to him. He took it. They lashed the wall together from opposite sides, her pulling him, driving the iron spike she had brought through the knot and into the post below. The wind hit them both like a flat hand, and neither of them went down. When it was done, she opened the canvas pack. Iron spikes, new rope, dried meat, a tin of salve, bandages already cut to length. She did not ask how bad his shoulder was. She put her hand on it, felt where the bone sat wrong, pressed her lips together and wrapped it. Her hands were sure. Not gentle, sure the way you wrap something that needs to hold, not something that needs comfort. He watched her face while she worked. She did not look up. Outside, the wind found a new angle, and the cattle pressed closer, and the single lantern she had carried up threw their shadows long against the patched wall, and held. April brought mud and croft. The snow came off the valley in sheets running brown down the wheel ruts, turning the road in front of my gate into something a horse sank to the fetlock in. The willows had gone yellow-green overnight, the way they do that sudden color that looks wrong after a long gray winter, too bright, like a bruise turning. I was on the porch with my coffee when I heard the buggy. 2 horses this time. Croft's lacquered rig, and behind it a flat wagon with 2 of his hired men on the bench, and something in the bed covered with canvas. The sheriff's horse tied to the back. They came up the road throwing mud off every wheel, and Croft stepped down before the buggy had fully stopped, which told me his patience had run shorter than usual. He had papers in his hand. Silas, same tone as October. Same smile, though it sat differently this morning, tighter at the corners like a boot that had dried wrong. I've come to settle this business. I drank my coffee. He came through the gate without being invited. The sheriff behind him and his 2 men stayed on the wagon. Up close, I could see the paper in his hand was the deed to Maeve's property, already drawn up with new lines of text added at the bottom. He had done it before he came. He had been that certain. 6 months, he said, stopping at the base of my steps. I've been patient, Silas. Man can't say I haven't been patient, but a deal is a deal, and the terms were plain. He squared the paper against his palm. 50 head alive off sorrow's crest. Not one man in this county believed it possible, and I believe it less now than I did in October. That right, I said. Your daughter went up there in February. He shook his head, performing sorrow badly. That's on you. A father who sends his only child into a blizzard to die beside a worthless drifter. He paused to let the fence folk take that in. There were 6 of them today gathered at the gate the way people gather when word gets around. Well, a man answers for his choices. He held the deed out toward me. I did not move. Those men of yours, I said. The ones who cut the rope on the shelter wall up at the crest. Something crossed his face. Quick, and then gone. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. No, I said. I don't expect you do. He took 1 step up onto my bottom stair. Sign the deed, Silas. The girl is gone. The drifter is gone. The cattle are gone. It's finished, and you know it. And standing here with your coffee pretending otherwise is just an old man's pride. And pride doesn't pay what you owe me. The sheriff looked at the mud. Croft turned back to his hired men and made a gesture, come on up, and the one on the left reached back and lifted the canvas on the wagon bed and pulled out 2 burlap sacks, empty, folded flat. Brought them to the gate. For bones. For remains. He had brought sacks for remains. I looked at those sacks a long moment. The burlap was new. He had purchased it new. He had stood in a store and bought clean sacks and folded them and put them in his wagon and driven out here in the April mud, and he had done all of that already, knowing what he intended to say and how he intended to say it. My coffee had gone cold again. I set the cup on the rail. I stepped to the edge of the porch, to the top stair, and I looked out past Croft and past his men and past the fence folk, and I fixed my eyes on the trail mouth at the north end of the road, where the pine trees stood black against the white sky and the morning mist was still thick between the trunks. I did not point. I did not smile. I just looked, and I waited for Croft to hear what I was already hearing. The sound coming down through the mist, low and steady and alive. The sound of hooves on wet ground, more hooves than 2 horses make, far more. They came out of the mist the way morning comes slow at first, then all at once. Vance rode point on the gray horse, Maeve beside him on her roan, and behind them the cattle filled the road from ditch to ditch, a dark moving mass that breathed fog into the cold April air. 50 head. Every one of them on their own legs, moving easy, unhurried, the way animals move when they are not afraid. And behind the cattle calves, 11 of them, maybe 12, small and leggy, and pressing close to their mothers born up on that ridge through the worst winter in a decade alive. Croft turned from the trail to me and back to the trail. His mouth opened and nothing came out. The fence folk had gone completely still. Vance and Maeve rode through the gate at a walk, and the cattle followed, filling the yard, their breath and their smell and the soft knock of their hooves, replacing every sound Croft had made. Maeve swung down from her saddle before the roan had fully stopped. She was lean and weathered, and her coat was patched at both elbows with a different leather rough work done by hand in bad light. She walked to the porch and stood beside me without looking at Croft at all. Vance stayed mounted. He looked down at Croft from the saddle the way a man looks at a post he is deciding whether to pull. Croft found his voice. How? It came out wrong, not a question, just the words stripped of everything he'd practiced on the drive out here. He looked at the calves, and something moved in his face that he could not arrange back into contempt fast enough. You had nothing up there. You had a skinning knife and a broken-down shelter and 50 animals that should have died in November. How did you have the tools? He didn't bring them, I said. Croft turned to me. I took my time. I picked up my cold coffee, remembered it was cold, set it back down. Maeve did, I said. Started 3 weeks before the first snow. Packed mule loads up the back trail. Lumber rope, iron spikes, grain, dried meat. Medicine. Everything a man would need to keep 50 cattle alive through a hard winter on an exposed ridge. Cached it in the granite cut above the shelter site. I looked at my daughter. She drew the plans herself. Calculated the weight, the trips, the timing. Every load up before the ground froze hard enough to make it impossible. The sheriff had taken a step back from Croft without appearing to notice he'd done it. You knew, Croft said. Quiet now. The performance was gone. You knew when you set the terms. I knew my daughter, I said. Figured the rest would follow. Croft's face had gone a color between gray and white, the color of old ash. He looked at the deed in his hand. He looked at the cattle in my yard. He looked at the calves. His mouth worked once. Then Vance reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a sack, not burlap, heavy canvas, dark with use, and he swung down from the gray horse in one motion. His left arm still carried slightly wrong at the shoulder, and he walked to where Croft stood. He held the sack out at chest height and opened his fingers. It dropped. It hit the mud between Croft's polished boots with a weight that silenced the last of the fence folk. Gold coin, the price of every white wolf pelt he had taken on that ridge. Through the long, dark months, rare animals worth 3 times the common gray animals that only came down to the lower timber in hard winters, and that a man with a trapper's eye and 6 months of nothing but time could find and take cleanly. Enough to retire the note entire. Enough to leave Croft nothing to hold. Croft did not pick it up. Vance stepped back. He straightened his coat with his good hand. He turned to the porch and looked at me and touched the brim of his hat once, not a flourish, just a mark the way you mark a line in a ledger when an account is settled. Then he turned to Maeve. She was already looking at him. She had been looking at him since he rode through the gate. Her hands were still at her sides, and her chin was level, and she looked at him the way she had looked at that fence line in the snow, like a problem she had already decided to solve. He held out his hand. She took it. They walked past the cattle and past the buggy and past the 2 hired men who moved out of their way without being asked, and they went through the gate and down the road together and did not look back. I looked at Croft. He was still staring at the sack of coin in the mud at his feet. The deed had gone soft in his grip, the paper creasing where his fingers had tightened and then let go. The sheriff cleared his throat. He stopped, started again. I'll be getting back to town. He left. The fence folk left. Croft's hired men climbed back on the wagon without being told and sat there waiting. Croft bent down finally and picked up the sack. He straightened. He looked at me one last time. I poured my cold coffee off the side of the porch into the mud and went inside to put a fresh pot on. I left the door open.